Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. That said, today is a bit of a special treat since we're actually returning to an earlier title, specifically Clover Bites' grotesque Metroidvania, Grime. Specifically due to their recently released Colors of Rot DLC. So, join me as I talk shop about the changes and whether they breathed new life into the mix or if the experience found itself spoiled. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Also, if you're curious about the base game, you can check out my video on Grime as a whole, which I've helpfully linked in the description, mostly because my focus is on all the new changes they've incorporated. Though, forewarning, it really is in your best interest to start a file from scratch, considering the scopes of these tweaks range across the entire gameplay experience, and you'll likely miss a number of them if you're simply backtracking. That said, it'll be some time until you notice the narrative tweaks. That's not to say there aren't any at the start, as there's a few odd encounters you can stumble across, such as the vases, or an entirely new side quest of sorts involving the secret misbegotten amalgam boss in the base game. That said, the biggest adjustment to the game's overarching story is the extension of the garden's narrative thread into the brand new area, the child bed, which essentially serves as the cradle for the mysterious entity known as the child. Whilst its influence has been felt in the base game in tandem with the appearance of the eyes and flowering enemies, this recent DLC really serves to provide it a spotlight. More importantly, between the new questline that crops up in the area and the accompanying enemy and item lore, you can get a bit closer to understanding its place within the crux of things. Whilst the relative scope of this adjustment is still fairly narrow in the greater scheme of things, it's a worthy addition all the same. Which brings us to the shifts to the gameplay, and perhaps the first one you'll encounter is the differences to the world at large. Grime is a bit more porous than it used to be, with the addition of a few new shortcuts to existing areas, as well as a fair number leading to the new optional area. More importantly, there's more nerve passes, which somewhat mitigates some of the travel time that was baked into the original version, so early backtracking isn't quite as brutal. Something which is further mitigated by the improvements to the movement abilities as a whole, which was one of my central gripes about Grime, since movement was fairly slow-paced, to the point that the most efficient means of fast traveling, warping between checkpoints specifically, was barred, until after you've essentially beaten the game. The way Colors of Rot chooses to address this is by instead tying the fast travel ability to one of the bosses in the new region, the child bed. While this still might make it a somewhat late game inclusion, it's still attainable at a point where you might be able to appreciate it for a couple more hours than you would normally, especially if you're the sort inclined towards exploration. There's also a dash ability you can acquire, which I have mixed feelings on this one, because if you jump it gets cancelled and there's a bit of startup on it, which can make it a bit awkward to use given a lot of uneven surfaces in certain areas, but it's helpful all the same. That said, there was also the slow fall ability, and this one is it just makes so many of those earlier falling puzzles a lot more accessible and generally mitigates the amount of death by gravity that you'll have to deal with, something that's already been mitigated slightly by some tweaks to falling damage. Admittedly, these changes can make a number of the pre-existing platforming puzzles a fair bit more manageable, but that's offset by the simple fact that there's now a number of secret obstacle courses, which now require a firm grasp of the new abilities in order to make your way through, and just some secrets scattered through the world that function much the same. Honestly, it's pretty satisfying as a whole, especially since there's a whole lot new weapons and armors to find and toy around with, some of which provide some fairly distinct abilities which are different from modifying the traits from the base game and actually include things like reducing the damage you take or allowing you to heal whenever you hit an enemy. Speaking of which, there's also been some tweaks to the healing system. Now, in the base game, one of your primary means of doing so was by filling up charges of your breath gauge, which generally meant getting adept at the parry system, as while there are items that provide breath, they were generally limited. Now, while this give and take of parries and using the items to recharge breath is left unchanged in and of itself, there's now another way to heal, vis-a-vis the crystal runners. These little critters have been scattered about the world, and when you manage to hunt down and kill 3 of them, you get a healing item that replenishes whenever you use a checkpoint, which definitely helps to pad your survivability. There's also a spare you can get from a quest alongside an infinite use recall item for getting back to checkpoints, which sticks with the mobility theme in the DLC, to the point that I literally shaved off 5 hours from my first playthrough in this one, including the fact that I tackled all of the bonus content, so these tweaks definitely add up. And that's despite the fact that the new area is massive. Actually exploring the childbed is a pretty time-consuming endeavor, to the point that the only other region that took me a similar time frame was the Carven Palace. And that's including the fact that the childbed kicked my ass so badly, I found myself taking a break until I could get a double jump to come back, simply to provide myself more options to navigate the place. It's genuinely labyrinthine, and a bit tricky at times, due to the new biome hazards and enemies, though again, there are some new traits to find here as well from the new enemies that are introduced, and picking those ones up are fairly interesting. In fact, some of these traits actually provide some viable options for making a health-oriented build now, such as a trait that causes you to fire off attacks whenever you regain breath while capped, which scales with your health. There's even an item that scales up with your stamina. More or less, there's a lot more options insofar as to how to build your character, and a few new hunt points to find besides, so you can experiment with the new skills and overall flesh out your build better. And you'll need to, because while I generally got through the various bosses this run through in a fairly efficient manner, the DLC bosses are no joke, with a special mention to one of the 2 childbed challengers, the Surrogate Vulture. This is just such a great encounter, with a lot of mechanics that help to make it memorable as can be, including a rather nasty surprise that caught me off guard midway through the fight. And I suppose that's actually something that extends to the new enemy and level design at large. I did not expect the new critters to look as great as they did, and also to continue being uncomfortable nightmare fuel. That said, the real highlight here, beyond new armors allowing for further fashion souls options and the really cool cinematic that's lodged into the childbed area, was the soundtrack. I enjoyed the soundtrack in the base game, especially tracks like the super creepy ambience that play as you navigate the garden. And what they brought for the new biome, the childbed, certainly holds up in compared to the old themes. Though, what truly stuck with me here was the various tracks that accompanied the new bosses. They are absolutely gorgeous. But yeah, anyways, now that I'm done gushing, I may as well boil things down, and the simple fact of the matter is, this DLC was, on the whole, a net positive for me. It provided me with a legitimately good reason to return to the grim world of Grime, and gave me the tools necessary to not only make that journey a bit more accessible, it also provided enough new content and changed around once familiar elements that I found myself continually surprised. Plus, it was a lot of fun innovating a brand new trait tree once I found enough skills that suitably synergized with each other and what I was doing, which was not a glass cannon build this time. It was all strength and health, baby. Oh, also, there is the incorporation of the Prey Gauntlet. I haven't really talked much about this, but it was added as a new prize for when you beat the game, and it essentially just lets you have rematches against the game's various bosses. System-wise, it's interesting enough, but mostly it's just there for if you want to revisit a memorable fight, since there's no rewards. That said, this probably saves time for people like Gelot, who want to make perfect boss battle videos without needing to reset repeatedly. In any case, I'd say that as an addition, and one you get for free, it's definitely a solid hit and offers a bit of something to everyone, including the lorehounds in the audience. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.